Get down. She didn't move. I have 40 centimeters left. Lorenzo Conti didn't repeat himself often. People listened the first time, but this woman standing on a scaffold in his father's estate like she belonged there didn't even look worried. That was the first problem. The gates opened too slowly. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Lorenzo noticed everything. The delay in the gates, the empty guard post, the silent fountain. He noticed all of it before his car had fully stopped. And by the time his door opened, every nerve in his body was already doing what it had been trained to do since he was 19. Calculating. His estate manager had sent 4 words that morning. Your father's study is open. His father had been dead for 6 years. Lorenzo had been in the car within the grasping hour. He stepped through the front entrance and stopped. Something was wrong. The corridor was intact. Nothing broken, nothing stolen. Just empty in the Banson particular way that told him the emptiness was deliberate. The staff was gone. Every one of them, not missing, removed. The kind of gone that didn't happen by accident. And on a scaffold above the floor, someone was still working. A woman, in paint-flecked overalls, was touching up gilded crown molding with a small brush like she had absolutely nowhere else to be. She looked down at him without surprise. You must be the son, she said. Not a question. There's cold pasta in the kitchen. Staff left around noon. I didn't think it was my place to get involved. Lorenzo looked at her for a long moment. Get down. I have 40 centimeters left. No hesitation. No apology. Behind him, his 2 men were already moving through the ground floor. He heard the systematic sweep begin. Doors, corridors, lower, rooms. 4 minutes. That was the standard. He kept his eyes on the woman. Down. Now she looked at her brush. She looked at the molding. She came down. She stood in front of him, calm, straight-backed, mildly inconvenienced. And he studied at her the way he studied everything. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was normal. She was not afraid, which was either very good or very bad. And he had not yet decided which. Sandra Obi, she said before he could speak. Architectural restoration. Contract is with your estate manager if you need to see it. My team finished their sections weeks ago. I stayed for the final pass. His phone was already in his hand. 1 call and her full file arrived in 9 minutes flat. Passport. Work history. Financial records. Professional references going back 6 years. Clean. Thoroughly. Unremarkably clean. He looked up from the screen. You're staying on the property until I say otherwise. Sandra blinked once. I was already staying. I am almost done. Somewhere in the east corridor, one of his men called the all clear. Lorenzo slid his phone into his pocket and looked at this woman who had just twice told the most feared man in Milan to wait. He had a feeling those 40 centimeters were going to cost him considerably more than he had budgeted for. By the following morning, Sandra had a guard outside her door. She discovered this when she opened it at 6:45 with her project binder under one arm and a thermos of coffee she had made herself because the kitchen was apparently still functional even if the cook was not. The guard, broad-shouldered, professional, entirely expressionless, looked at her. She looked at him. Then, she stepped around him and walked toward the east wing, because she had work to do. He followed her. She stopped walking. Are you going to hand me tools as well? Or just watch? He said nothing. She decided to name him Statua, and moved on. Lorenzo found her in the east corridor 40 minutes later. He was dressed like a man who had already made 17 decisions before breakfast, which Sandra suspected was accurate. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her the way she imagined. He looked at contracts, searching for the clause that caused problems. Your phone will be monitored, he said. All outside communication requires clearance. You do not leave the property without my direct approval. These are not requests. Sandra set down her binder. And if I say no, you won't. She considered this. It was unfortunately a reasonable assessment. She was in the final stretch, of the most technically demanding project of her career. Walking away now would, I mean leaving the West Wing cornice half restored, and a section of original flooring unsealed, and that was simply not something she was professionally capable of doing. "Fine," she said, "but I need access to the full East Wing, the back, upper storage room, and the original blueprint archive in the basement. If any of those are restricted, this conversation becomes longer." Something shifted, briefly in his expression. Not warmth exactly, more like the slight recalibration of a man who had expected resistance to look different. "The basement archive is available. Stay out of the study corridor on the second floor. I have no reason to go there. People rarely need a reason." She picked up her binder. "I'm a restoration specialist, Signor Conti. I care about what your walls are made of, not what's behind them." She paused and looked up at him. "Professionally speaking." He held her gaze for a moment, then left without responding. Sandra turned back to the east wall and made a small note in the Burke margin of her log. "Security tighter than expected. Boss, controlled, watchful, slightly suspicious of everything." She had counted 4 unnecessary silences already. The confinement had also cost her. With 3 wings now restricted during his security sweeps, the estate manager had quietly approved a 4-week extension to her contract. She logged it without complaint and moved her completion date forward. 3 floors above her, Lorenzo pulled up the estate's internal camera feed and watched her go back to work. She was, as far as he could determine, exactly what her file said she was. That fact, rather than comforting him, made him more careful. In his experience, people who were exactly what they appeared to be were either very innocent or very good. He had not yet determined which one Sandra Obi was. The estate had a problem with its East Wing, and it had nothing to do with Lorenzo Conti. Sandra stood in front of the wall on the second morning and tilted her head. Something wasn't adding up. The paneling was original, good mahogany, consistent with the rest of the corridor, but the lower section was wrong, too uniform, like someone had tried to make it look old. She photographed it, logged it, and moved on. It was a small inconsistency, but it didn't feel like one. That was what happened when a building was added to over generations by people who each thought they understood the original intent. What interested her more was the ventilation. There were 4 air registers on record. She could only find 3. That meant one of 2 things. The blueprint was wrong, or something had been hidden there. She made a note. Investigate east wall lower section, possible sealed register, or structural inconsistency. Follow airflow. 3 floors away in his study, Lorenzo was reviewing the same blueprint she was using, not because he was thinking about ventilation, but because he was thinking about what his father's estate manager had known and when. The study door being opened was not a malfunction. Someone had a key. That narrowed it to 7 people, 2 of whom were dead and 3 of whom Lorenzo was already watching. His phone buzzed. Marco Rossi, his longest-serving associate and the only man in Milan whose judgment Lorenzo trusted without reservation, spoke without greeting. "Vito made 2 calls this morning, neither to anyone on your approved list." Lorenzo set the phone face down and looked at the blueprint. Director Vito had been with the Conti operation for 22 years. He had been there before Lorenzo took over, before Lorenzo's father got sick, before everything that came after. He was the kind of man who confused longevity with ownership, and Lorenzo had been watching that particular miscalculation develop for 3 years. He had left it alone because Vito was efficient and loyalty, even imperfect loyalty, had a value. But opening the study was not an efficiency. It was a statement. That evening, Sandra's daily log came through the internal system as required. Lorenzo read it without expectation and found 11 detailed restoration entries, 3 material cross-references for photographs of wall sections, and 1 margin note that read, "Estate feels like it's been holding its breath. Not sure since when. He read that line twice. Then he closed the log and looked out at the darkened courtyard and thought about a house that had been holding its breath since the Pline's night. His father had stopped speaking to him directly 18 months before he died. Downstairs, Sandra finished her coffee, looked at the east wall one more time, and had the distinct feeling that the house was trying to tell her something. She just hadn't figured out the language yet. Neither of them planned to be in the kitchen at the same time. Sandra arrived at 7:15 because the light in the east wing was better before 8, and she needed to eat before she climbed anything. Lorenzo arrived 4 minutes later because his meeting with Marco had ended early, and he had apparently forgotten briefly that the kitchen was a room other people also used. They looked at each other. Neither left. Sandra moved to the stove, with the energy of someone who had decided this was not a complicated situation. She had pasta from the previous night, 2 eggs, and a practical attitude. Lorenzo poured coffee and stood by the window and looked out at the courtyard in a way that suggested he was thinking about 17 other things, and the kitchen was simply where his body had ended up. The staff didn't leave because they were afraid, Sandra said, not looking up from the pan. A pause. What makes you say that? They took their personal items, all of them. You don't do that when you flee. You grab your phone and go. They packed. Someone gave them time to pack, which means someone gave them notice. Notice requires planning. Planning requires a reason beyond fear. She pushed the pasta around the pan. They were paid to leave. The courtyard was very interesting to Lorenzo for a long moment. You're a restoration specialist, he said. I'm observant, she replied. It's the same skill set, honestly. You look at a surface and ask why it looks the way it does, and who made it that way and when. She plated her pasta and turned around. I'm not asking you to confirm it. I'm just telling you what I see. He looked at her steadily. And what else do you see? That your coffee is going cold and you've been standing in the same spot for 6 minutes. She sat down at the kitchen table and that whoever paid the staff to leave didn't account for me, which means they either didn't know I was here or didn't think I mattered. She picked up her fork. People underestimating me is genuinely one of my most useful professional tools. Lorenzo picked up his coffee. He drank it cold without expression. She had arrived at the correct conclusion, the exact correct conclusion through nothing but careful attention. No access to any sensitive information, no inside knowledge, just observation and logic, the same way she apparently read walls. That was either completely harmless or the most sophisticated thing he had ever seen. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, which surprised them both. The eggs are done, she said. I can see that. There are 2. I can also see that. She slid the pan toward him without comment. He served himself without thanking her, which she had expected, and they ate in a silence that was somehow not uncomfortable. Lorenzo filed that away as the most suspicious thing yet. Lorenzo did not make a habit of reading other people's private documents. He told himself this while he was reading Sandra's restoration journal. To be fair, it had been left on the main hall table, openly unlocked, next to a set of material samples and a tape measure, and he had picked it up expecting to find something. In his world, people who were exactly what they appeared to be were collecting information for someone. That was simply how things worked. He had been patient. He had watched. He had given her time to make a mistake. The journal contained no mistakes because the journal contained no deception. Page after page of meticulous restoration entries, each one dated, each one cross-referenced to the original estate, blueprint, detailed sketches of wall sections, cornice profiles, flooring grain, patterns, notes about material aging, humidity effects, the difference between original craft work and later imitations, photographs taped flat against the pages with professional precision. It was genuinely a restoration journal, one of the most thorough he had ever seen, which was not something he had expected to be thinking. He turned to a page near the back, notes on the east wing, and found the margin entries. She wrote in the margins when something didn't fit into the official log format. Small observations, personal ones. He read 3 before he could stop himself. Day 12. The older parts of the house feel like they were built by someone who wanted things to last. The newer additions feel like someone was compensating for something. Day 19. Found a sealed register in the east wing. Airflow pattern suggests a void behind the lower panel. Logging for investigation. Day 23. Owner's son. Extremely controlled. Possibly hasn't slept in days. Runs on coffee and intimidation. Remind self. Not your project, Sandra. He read the last one twice. Then he closed the journal, placed it back, exactly as he had found it. Same angle, same position relative to the tape, measure, and walked back to his study. He sat down. He looked at his desk. Not your project, Sandra. He had been observed the way she observed walls, cataloged, filed under things that need attention, but aren't my responsibility. He was not sure if he found that insulting or in some way he could not fully articulate, something close to a relief. His phone rang. Marco. Vito had a third call. Marco said this time to someone inside the property network. I'm narrowing down who. Do it quickly, Lorenzo said. He hung up and looked at the window for a long moment. Then he thought about the east wing margin note, a void behind the bay, lower panel. She had found an inconsistency in the house that 20 years of staff had walked past without noticing. He picked up his phone again. He pulled up her file for the third time since she arrived. Still clean. He was starting to believe it. That was what worried him. Marco Rossi arrived on a Thursday, liked Sandra within 20 minutes. This was not what Lorenzo had expected from the visit. Marco was the most composed person Lorenzo had ever employed, a man who communicated primarily through precise sentences and the occasional single nod. He had once sat through a 4-hour negotiation without changing his expression. Lorenzo had known him for 11 years and could count on one hand the number of times he had heard him laugh. Sandra made him laugh twice before lunch. It started in the main corridor where Marco had paused to look at a section of wall Sandra had recently completed. He made a polite comment about the finish. She looked at him with the expression of a professional who had been paid a precedent facet compliment by someone who did not fully understand what they were complimenting, and said very pleasantly, "That's kind." The previous restorer used modern lacquer on a mid-century surface and called it authentic. I spent 11 days fixing it. It was like someone put a new cover on an old book and called it a new book and hoped no one would look too closely. Marco blinked. Then he laughed. A real one, short and unbarred. Lorenzo watched this from the corridor entrance and felt something he could not immediately categorize. It was not jealousy. It was more like the specific discomfort of watching someone navigate your most controlled environment with complete ease, as though the rules of the space did not quite apply to them. He joined them. The conversation moved to the estate's original architecture, which Sandra discussed with focused enthusiasm, and Lorenzo noticed that Marco was listening to her the way people listened when they were genuinely interested rather than politely waiting to speak. "She's good," Marco said simply. When Sandra had moved back to her work, "She's contained," Lorenzo said. "Those aren't opposites." Marco turned to face him. Vito's contact inside the property network was Giovanni Rossi, your gate coordinator. The pleasant atmosphere of the past 20 minutes reorganized itself instantly into something colder. Giovanni had worked the estate for 9 years. He was the reason the gates had been slow. He had been placed there deliberately. A control point. Now he was being pulled out. "He's been replaced," Lorenzo said this morning quietly. Marco glanced toward the east wing. "Vito is moving faster than we expected. He wanted us distracted by the staff disappearance while he repositioned internally. He didn't expect you to come home so quickly." A pause. He also clearly didn't expect her to stay. Down the corridor, the faint sound of Sandra's work, precise, unhurried, filled the silence between them. She noticed the void in the east wall, Lorenzo said. Not to Marco specifically, more like a thought that had arrived out loud. Marco looked at him for a moment. Has she said anything about it? She logged it. Hasn't opened it. He paused. Hasn't asked me about it either. Marco was quiet for a moment. Interesting, he said, which, from Marco, was practically a paragraph. Lorenzo said nothing, but he looked down the corridor for a moment longer than was necessary. Sandra found it on a Prazeretone, Sandra Fromans, Tuesday, several weeks into confinement, at approximately 2 inches the afternoon. She had been working her way along the lower east wall with a humidity gauge and a flashlight following the airflow pattern she had logged on day 19. The register was definitely sealed. She had confirmed that much, but sealed registers were common in older estates. What was less common was the temperature differential she was reading along the lower left panel. The air behind it was cooler. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone would notice without a gauge, but consistently, measurably cooler. She pressed her palm flat against the surface. Then she ran 2 fingers along the right edge of the panel and found what she had been professionally trained to find. A join that didn't match its neighbor. Different hand. Different decade. Someone had built this panel to match the surrounding wall. But they had not been the same craftsman who built the wall. The gap at the seam was 1 millimeter wider than it should have been. Sandra exhaled through her nose. She took 4 photographs from 4 different angles. She logged the temperature readings. She wrote in her project binder, East Wing, Lower Panel Section 7C. Non-original installation concealed join right edge. Void confirmed behind surface dimensions unknown. Owner to be notified before any further investigation. She closed the binder. The second floor was off limits. This wasn't. She paused for a moment. She did not open the panel. She found Lorenzo in his study on the second floor, which required her to pass Statua, whose real name she had since learned was Officer Bellini, and knock on a door that felt like it had rarely been knocked on from the outside. A pause. Then, come in. He was at his desk with documents she was not meant to see, so she looked at the doorframe instead. There's something behind the east wing panel in section 7C. I found this seam this afternoon. She held up her binder. Everything I found is logged here. Photographs, temperature readings, measurements. He looked at her. You didn't open it? No. Why not? She gave him the look she reserved for questions that answered themselves. Because it isn't mine to open, Signor Conti. Whatever is behind that wall belongs to this house. This house belongs to you. She set the binder on the small table near the door. I thought you should know before I continued any work in that section. Something shifted in his face. Not much, just a slight movement in the jaw. The kind that happened when a person recalibrated something internally. Show me, he said. They walked to the east wing in silence. She showed him the seam, the temperature, differential, the join. He crouched down and looked at the lower edge for a long time without speaking. She stood behind him and gave him the room to think that she would have wanted. Finally, he stood. He looked at the panel. He looked at her. Leave this section for now, he said. I'll come back to it. Sandra nodded and picked up her kit. She had taken 3 steps when he spoke again. You could have opened it. I wouldn't have known. She turned around. I would have known, she said simply, and walked back to her work. Behind her, Lorenzo stood in front of the panel for a very long time. He opened it alone at night when the estate was quiet. Lorenzo had waited 2 days, not out of hesitation, but because he needed to be certain no one else knew about the panel before he opened it. He had swept the corridor himself. He had reviewed the camera placement. He had done everything a man like him did before stepping into something he could not yet calculate. The panel swung inward on a simple pivot mechanism. Behind it was a narrow room, more of a wide corridor than a room really, lined on both sides, with wooden shelving. On the shelves were boxes, each one labeled in his father's handwriting. Lorenzo stood in the entrance for a moment and simply looked. His father's handwriting was small and precise and slightly forward-leaning, and he had not seen it since the last letter that arrived 7 months before his death. A letter that contained practical instructions about 3 accounts and nothing personal whatsoever. That was the kind of man his father had been. Practical, sealed, perfectly controlled on every surface, and apparently not on any of the ones behind the wall. He pulled the first box. Inside, correspondence, years of it. His father writing to men whose names Lorenzo recognized as the original founders of what would become the Milan operation. Letters that were careful, deliberate, and over time increasingly uncomfortable in their honesty. His father had not simply built the syndicate, he had built it with full awareness of what it would become, and had spent the last decade of his life negotiating internally with that knowledge. The last box on the bottom shelf contained a single document, unfinished, 43 pages, the last of which ended mid-sentence. Lorenzo pulled the document from the box, leaned against the shelving with his back straight, and read all 43 pages where he stood. It took an hour and 20 minutes. When he came out, Sandra was sitting in the hallway with her back against the wall, her project binder open on her knees, reviewing what appeared to be material specifications for the West Wing floor. She looked up without surprise, as if she had simply been waiting for a reasonable moment, and this was it. He stopped in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, and looked at the ceiling for a moment before he spoke. The corridor was dim. Neither of them turned on a light. He didn't plan to speak, and then he did. He told her about the document, not the operational details, not the names, but the architecture of it. A man trying to undo quietly, and too late, what he had built. Pages of careful reasoning that stopped mid-sentence like a door left open. Sandra listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He ran out of time, she said. He had, in years. People don't use the time they have. They use the time they finally believe they've run out of. She looked at her binder, then at him. What happens now? He looked at the closed panel. Now I finished the sentence. The meeting with Director Vito was scheduled for 9 inches the morning and lasted 41 minutes. Lorenzo had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, thoroughly, quietly, with the kind of patience that looked like stillness and wasn't. He had the documentation from his father's archive organized into a clear sequence. He had Marco present as a witness. He had 3 specific outcomes in mind and had mapped the route to each one. Vito arrived looking like a man who was confident. He was holding the stronger hand. He sat down across the desk, adjusted his cuffs, and smiled in the way that people smiled when they believed the other person in the room did not fully understand the situation. Lorenzo let him smile. Then he opened the first document. The smile took approximately 94 seconds to dissolve. What followed was not a confrontation in the way people imagined confrontations. There were no raised voices, no dramatic moments, just a man being shown piece by piece the precise shape of what he had done. The intercepted correspondence, the staff payments, the calls to Giovanni, the 22 years of quiet repositioning that had passed itself off as loyalty. Vito's defense was predictable. He had protected the operation. He had protected the operation, Conti name. He had made difficult decisions that preserved what the family had built. You made decisions, Lorenzo said, that were not yours to make. Vito leaned forward. Removing me won't end anything, Lorenzo. I have relationships in this operation that predate you. If I go quietly, it unsettles things. If I go loudly, it unsettles them considerably more. He sat back. Your father understood that maintaining the structure sometimes required burying the things that destabilized it. My father, Lorenzo said, spent the last years of his life trying to disagree with himself about that. He just didn't finish the argument. He slid the final document across the desk. Vito looked at it. He looked at Lorenzo. He straightened his cuffs again, which was the only thing he had left to do. "This isn't over," he said, standing. "It rarely is," Lorenzo said. "But this part is." Marco walked Vito out. Lorenzo remained at the desk for a long moment, looking at the cleared table. His phone buzzed. A text from Marco. "Done. He'll move carefully. He has too much to lose in a visible fight, but he won't stop. Watch for quiet pressure over the next few weeks." Lorenzo typed back. "Noted." Then he looked at the window and did something he almost never did. He exhaled, fully, like a man setting something down that he had been carrying for longer than he had realized. He sat at the cleared desk for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to the kitchen, and made coffee, not because he wanted it, but because standing still suddenly felt like the wrong thing to do. 3 days after Vito's removal, the estate was quiet in a new way. The house was running, again, just without the tension, not the held breath quiet of the first week. That meant something was wrong and no one was saying it. This was the quiet of a house that had exhaled. Lorenzo noticed it in small things. The morning light in the main corridor. The way his own footsteps sounded different on the restored flooring. He had walked through 3 rooms that morning without checking the exits. That was new. Sandra was in the final stage of her work. The west wing, cornice, the last unsealed flooring section, the decorative ironwork on the upper landing. She moved through the estate with the focused efficiency of someone approaching completion. And Lorenzo found, without entirely meaning to, that he was aware of where she was in the house at most points during the day, not through the security feed, just through the sounds, the tap of tools, occasional quiet notes she hummed when she thought no one was near. He found her, in the main corridor one evening, reviewing her completion sketches at the foot and of the stairs, before and after photographs arranged in pairs, the original condition beside the finished restoration. He looked at them for a moment, without speaking. He kept his hands in his pockets and his weight where it was, which was for him the closest thing to being still, without purpose that he allowed himself. Sandra continued reviewing her notes, which he had come to understand was simply how she was. She made space for people without performing to it. "What did it look like?" he asked. "When you first arrived?" She found the day, 1 photographs, and laid them out without commentary. He looked at each pair, carefully. The dull, compromised surfaces against the restored ones. The dim corridor against the one he was currently standing in, where the original wood showed through cleanly, and the gilded molding held its detail. "It looks like it was always supposed to look like this," he said. Sandra nodded, still looking at her notes. "That's what restoration is. You're not inventing anything new. You're removing what was put on top of what was already there." She aligned 2 photographs at the edge. The house wasn't broken, it was just covered. He was quiet for a moment. "Is that how you see people?" he asked. Not aggressively, genuinely. She looked up at him then, directly, the way she always looked at things. She was trying to accurately assess. "I think some people are covered, yes," she said, "by what they've been through, what they've been told they have to be." She looked back at the photographs. "Doesn't always mean you can restore them. Sometimes the covering has been on too long and the original material underneath has changed, but you can at least see it. You can at least know it. It was there." Lorenzo looked at the corridor. He had grown up in this house. He had run through this corridor as a child and been corrected for it, and eventually stopped running entirely. And now it was restored, and he was 38 years old, standing in it at evening, which was something he had not allowed himself to do, without a reason, since he was young enough to not know what the house required of him. Sandra closed her binder. "West Wing is the last section. 2 weeks if no complications." 2 weeks, he said. Neither of them said what that meant. Sandra's last day was a Friday. The West Wing was finished. The flooring was sealed. The cornice was complete. The ironwork on the upper landing had been cleaned and retreated, and looked exactly like the original blueprint said it should. She walked the full estate one final time with her completion checklist, every section, every surface, and found nothing outstanding. She filed her completion report through the estate's internal system at 10:00 inches the morning. By 11, she had packed her equipment cases, rolled her drawings, and arranged everything in the entrance corridor, with the neat efficiency of someone who did not leave loose ends. Lorenzo found her there. He looked at the cases. He looked at her. He said, "I have a proposal." Sandra straightened up and gave him the expression she reserved for things she could already see the shape of. "I'm listening. A permanent consulting arrangement. A studio in Milan. 3 properties needing long-term work." He said it once, clearly. The way he said everything that mattered, without repetition, without decoration. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, not the hesitant quiet of someone considering, the settled quiet of someone who had already known what their answer was and was simply finding the right words to be fair about it. "It's a good offer," she said. "It's a genuinely good offer, and I want you to know. I mean that. But I came here to do a job and I finished it. That's what I do." She looked at him steadily. "You don't need someone to stay, Lorenzo. You need to learn how to be in this house without guards at every door." A pause. "You're already partway there. I watched you walk through the main corridor this morning without checking the exits." He looked at her. "I noticed things," she said, simply. She picked up the handle of her equipment case. She nodded once, satisfied, professional, warm, and held out her hand. He shook it, firm, brief. She smiled the way she smiled when a wall turned out to be worth saving. It was the most honest exchange he'd had in longer than he could accurately measure. She walked out the front gate. The gate opened at the correct speed. Lorenzo stood at the top of the restored staircase and looked at the entrance corridor, the clean gilded molding, the original flooring, the light coming through the east windows, exactly as it had been designed to 2 generations before any of this became what it became. The fountain was running. He stood there for a long time, not checking the exits, not calculating the room, just standing in it. In the garden below, a car pulled away down the road toward Milan, and Lorenzo Conti, feared across 3 districts, careful in every room, stood in a house that finally looked like home and understood quietly and completely that some people don't stay to change your world. They stayed just long enough to show you it was worth restoring.